The silence in Archive Sector 7 Gamma was a living thing, a pressurized substance that filled the lungs and coated the tongue with the taste of sterilized air and aged polymer. Elian moved through it as a fish moves through water, his existence defined by its currents and its weight. His world was a grid of brushed steel shelves reaching into the sodium-lit gloom, each one laden with the ghost of a forgotten time, stored in crystalline data wafers. He was an archivist, a curator of dead information, and the silence was his closest companion. It was a clean silence, an orderly silence, manufactured by the consortium to ensure focus and compliance. It was nothing like the chaotic, organic quiet of the world outside the city's geodomes, a world he had only ever seen in the very archives he maintained. He wore the uniform of his caste, a seamless dove-grey jumpsuit that wicked away moisture and clung just enough to betray the slightness of his frame. It was a body kept deliberately neutral, its biology muted, its instincts chemically leashed. Every morning he applied the stasis gel patch to the nape of his neck, a cool, clinical kiss of synthetic hormones that kept the omega within him dormant. It was a thick, viscous substance that smelled of ozone and antiseptic, the scent of his subjugation. He did not remember a time before the patch. He did not know his own scent, nor did he wish to. To be an omega in the consortium was to be a design flaw, a biological liability prone to emotional cascades and primitive urges that disrupted the meticulously calibrated social order. The patches made him functional. They made him invisible. They made him safe. His fingers, long and pale, traced the edge of a data wafer. It was labeled pre-unification, meteorological phenomena. He slotted it into the reader, and the air before him shimmered into a holographic display. Rain, a deluge of it, striking a pane of glass in a torrent of silver needles. The sound was a low, percussive roar, a chaotic symphony that felt alien and deeply unsettling to his silence-conditioned ears. He had seen rain before, of course, in these archives. He had studied its chemical composition, its atmospheric triggers, its historical impact on pre-consortium agriculture. He knew it as data. He did not know it as an experience. A flicker of something, a ghost of an emotion too faint to be named, stirred in the anesthetized space of his chest. He dismissed it as a somatic anomaly and made a mental note to check the efficacy of his current patch batch. Lately, he'd felt these flickers more often. A tremor in his hands when handling certain artifacts, a strange, hollow ache behind his ribs when the archive's nutrient paste dispenser hissed out his midday meal. The system was perfect. It was he who was becoming flawed. He powered down the hologram, the roaring silence of the rain collapsing back into the humming silence of the archive. His shift was over. The chronometer on his wrist glowed with the precise time, and he moved with the ingrained rhythm of his routine. He passed through the decontamination arch at the sector's exit, a fine mist bathing him in yet more sterilizing agents, stripping away the dust of history. He walked the silent, moving causeways of the city, a single grey figure among thousands of others, their faces placid, their movements economical. The city itself was an extension of the archive, all clean lines, recycled air, and the soft, ubiquitous glow of synthetic light. The sky above was a permanent, pearlescent dome, filtering out the unpredictable wrath of the real sun and broadcasting a soothing, algorithmically generated twilight. But tonight, the dome was dark. A system-wide diagnostic, the public announcements had chimed. a rare occurrence. For the first time in years, the city was exposed to the true night, and with it, the whims of the upper atmosphere. As he stepped from the causeway onto the pedestrian plaza near his designated living block, he felt it, a single, cold drop on his cheek. He stopped, his disciplined movements faltering. He looked up, not at a simulated sky, but at a churning, abyssal blackness. Another drop struck his forehead, then another. The rain began, not as the roaring deluge from the archive, but as a hesitant, scattered percussion. People around him, their routines disrupted, scurried for the covered walkways with quiet efficiency. There was no panic, only a swift, orderly retreat from the unexpected variable. Elian, however, remained frozen. The cold drops soaked into the thin fabric of his jumpsuit, raising goosebumps on his skin. He felt the patch at the nape of his neck, the stasis gel suddenly feeling slick, alien. A strange, sharp tingling sensation spread from the spot, a feeling like pins and needles, but deeper, in his blood. The rain was dissolving the gel's adhesive matrix. He knew this with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty. The gel, the very substance that held his biology in check, was washing away. He should have run. He should have sought shelter, returned to his block, and applied an emergency patch. It was the logical, the rational, the sane thing to do. But he couldn't move. The water ran down his face, into his eyes, and he blinked, the world blurring into a cascade of light and shadow. The sterile scent of the city, ozone, metal, cleansing agents, was being washed away, replaced by something else, something rich and dark and alive. The smell of wet duracrete, of ionized air, of life, petrichor. The word surfaced from the depths of the archive in his mind, the scent of rain on dry earth, and under it, something else was blooming, a fragrance from within himself, faint at first, then stronger, unfurling like a terrified flower. It was a scent he had never known, sweet and achingly vulnerable. Night-blooming jasmine, crushed and fragile, laced with the electric tang of ozone from the storm itself. It was the scent of his own fear, of his own body waking from a lifelong slumber. The tingling in his veins became a fire. A low, cramping ache started in his belly, a prelude to a biological cataclysm he had only ever read about in classified medical texts. Heat, his first heat. It was coming. It was here. And he was standing in the open, under the dark sky, being undone by the rain. Executor Kalen moved through the rain-slicked plaza with the fluid lethality of a predator. His uniform, a stark black composite armor that absorbed light and repelled water, made no sound. He was an instrument of the consortium's will, a guardian of its perfect order. His designation was Alpha, a biological reality that the system had not suppressed but honed, sharpening his instincts into tools of control and enforcement. Where Omegas were liabilities, Alphas were assets, their innate dominance and sensory acuity repurposed to detect and neutralize societal dissonance. His senses were a fine-tuned network, constantly scanning, analyzing, categorizing. The rain was a minor irritant, a layer of sensory noise he filtered out with practiced ease. He smelled the wet metal of the causeways, the faint ozonic signature of the malfunctioning sky dome, the collective, muted scent of the compliant populace hurrying for cover. All was as it should be. Orderly retreat in the face of an anomaly. He was on a routine patrol, his presence alone a deterrent to any potential disruption. His mind was a calm, cold repository of protocols and directives. Anomaly detected. Assess. Categorize. neutralize if necessary. Then he smelled it, through the blanket of the rain and the city's sterile perfume, a scent cut through the air like a shard of glass. It was alien, uncategorized, and it bypassed every filter his training had erected. It was not the scent of any known substance, nor was it the suppressed, neutral scent of a compliant citizen. It was wild, it was organic, it was intoxicating. Petrichor and ozone, yes, from the storm, but woven through it was something else, something achingly sweet and impossibly fragile. Night-blooming jasmine, but not the synthetic fragrance used in the upper-tier residential blocks. This was real, raw, alive, and it was laced with the unmistakable pheromonal signature of an omega in distress, a feral omega, unsuppressed, presenting. Every protocol in his head screamed at him. Threat level, crimson. An unsuppressed omega could trigger widespread social chaos. Their pheromones could incite atavistic territorialism in lower caste alphas, cause emotional instability in betas, and represented a fundamental breakdown of systemic control. The directive was clear: locate the source, sedate, and transfer to the Correction and Pacification Center for mandatory medical reintegration. It was a process from which few returned with their minds intact. His body moved before his conscious mind had finished processing the directive. He followed the scent, his movements no longer merely efficient, but driven by a deeper, more urgent imperative. The scent grew stronger, pulling him toward the center of the plaza, a siren song of distress and devastating sweetness. He saw a lone figure, standing stock-still in the downpour, a small grey shape against the gleaming black of the wet plaza floor. The figure was trembling, their head bowed. As Kalen drew closer, the scent became a physical force, flooding his senses, making the air thick and heavy in his lungs. It bypassed his higher brain functions and struck something ancient and dormant within his own biology. A low growl rumbled in his chest, an involuntary, possessive sound he hadn't made since his earliest days of training, before such responses were conditioned out of him. He clamped down on it with brutal self-control, his jaw tightening. This was a threat, a biological contaminant. He was the cure. He came to a halt a few feet from the figure. "Citizen," his voice was cold, precise, the regulation tone of an executor. "You are in violation of Public Ordinance 7.4, failure to seek shelter during an atmospheric event. You are also in violation of the Biological Purity Act. Identify yourself." The figure flinched, a small, violent tremor. They slowly lifted their head. The face was pale, delicate, framed by dark, rain-plastered hair. The eyes that met his were wide, with a terror so profound it was almost sublime. They were the color of storm clouds, filled with a bewildered panic he had only ever seen in reconditioning archives. But it was the scent, now impossibly concentrated around the omega, that shattered Kalen's composure. It wasn't just sweet jasmine and rain. There was something else in it, a unique, resonant frequency, a specific molecular signature that felt familiar. It was a familiarity that made no sense, a key turning in a lock he never knew existed deep within his genetic code. His training, his conditioning, his entire identity as an executor warred with a sudden, overwhelming wave of instinct. Protect. The word was not a thought. It was a physical command that surged through his veins. It was illogical. It was insane. This Omega was a threat to the order he was sworn to uphold. He was a problem to be solved, a variable to be eliminated. His hand should have gone to the sedative dispenser on his belt. He should have been reading the Omega their rights, calling for a containment unit. Instead, his hand clenched into a fist at his side, his knuckles white. He watched as the Omega's knees buckled, their body finally succumbing to the violent onset of the heat. They crumpled, a slow, graceful collapse onto the wet ground, and Kalen moved, not with the cold precision of an executor, but with a speed and grace that was purely predatory, purely instinctual. He caught the slight body before it hit the pavement, scooping the Omega into his arms. The contact was electric, a jolt of heat, of life, against the cold composite of his armor. The Omega let out a soft, pained whimper and curled into his chest, seeking warmth, seeking safety, guided by an instinct as powerful as Kalen's own. He held the Omega close, the rain plastering the thin grey jumpsuit to a body that was radiating a feverish heat. The scent was now an inescapable universe, and Kalen felt a cracked spiderweb through the cold, hard certainty of his world. He looked down at the pale face pressed against his chest plate. He did not know this person. He was a stranger, a deviant, a threat. But the scent belonged to him. It was a truth that defied logic, defied reason, defied his very existence. And in that moment, under the dark, weeping sky, Executor Kalen broke protocol. He turned not toward the correction center, but toward the sterile anonymity of his own high-security residence, carrying the source of the chaos in his arms. The apartment was a monument to control, a sterile white box suspended high in the city's residential spire, its windows polarized against the outside world, its air filtered to a clinical purity. Everything was recessed, seamless, and silent. It was Kalen's sanctuary, a place where the chaos of the city was reduced to data streams on a wall-sized monitor. It was the last place a feral Omega should ever be. He laid Elian on the low, severe lines of the synth-leather sofa. The Omega was barely conscious, caught in the delirious throes of a body at war with itself. His skin was flushed, beaded with a mixture of rain and sweat, and he trembled ceaselessly. The thin, wet jumpsuit clung to him, offering no modesty, revealing the desperate tension in his slight limbs. Kalen stood over him, a black monolith in the stark white room, his own body a battlefield. The executor in him was screaming, contaminant, security breach, unacceptable risk. He should be calling it in. His superior, Director Vance, would have a containment team here in minutes. The situation would be resolved. Order would be restored. But the alpha in him, an ancient, powerful beast that he had believed long tamed, was roaring. It saw the trembling figure not as a threat, but as something precious, something to be sheltered. Mine. The word echoed in the deepest parts of his mind, a possessive, primal declaration that terrified him. The scent was the cause. It had saturated the air in his apartment, clinging to the sterile surfaces, overriding the air purifiers. It was no longer just a scent. It was a presence. It filled his lungs, coated his tongue, and sent phantom signals through his nervous system. He felt the Omega's pain as a faint echo in his own body, the feverish heat as a warmth under his own skin. This was not a standard alpha response. This was something else, something specific. He stripped off his tactical gloves with sharp, angry movements and ran a hand over his face. His skin was cold, but his blood felt hot. He needed to reassert control. He was an executor. He was logic. He was order. He turned to his medical unit, a sterile panel in the wall. He could synthesize a broad-spectrum hormonal suppressant. It would be a brutal shock to the Omega's system, but it would halt the heat, neutralize the pheromonal output. It was the logical course of action. His fingers hovered over the touch-sensitive panel, the directives clear in his mind. Sedate, contain, report. But he couldn't do it. The thought of flooding that fragile, trembling body with a dose of harsh chemicals felt like a physical violation. It felt wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. He growled in frustration, a low, guttural sound that was shocking in the silence of the room. He was losing control. He, who was the very embodiment of control. He turned back to the sofa. Elian had curled into a tight ball, his arms wrapped around his stomach as a wave of cramps visibly seized him. A soft, keening sound escaped his lips, a pure, unfiltered expression of pain. It lanced through Kalen's carefully constructed composure and struck him square in the chest. Without thinking, he crossed the room and knelt by the sofa. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before he gently placed it on Elian's forehead. The heat was shocking, a dry, burning fever. The Omega flinched at his touch but didn't pull away. Instead, a shudder went through him, and he seemed to lean into the contact just slightly. A small, almost imperceptible sigh left his lips. Kalen's own body responded instantly. A strange sense of calm, of rightness, settled over the raging instinct. The roaring in his head subsided to a low, protective rumble. His presence, his touch, was soothing the Omega. And in soothing him, it was soothing himself. It was a feedback loop, a circuit he had never known existed. He needed to get the Omega out of the wet clothes. It was a practical necessity. The wet fabric would sap his body heat, exacerbating the fever. It was a clinical, logical thought, but as he reached for the zipper on the grey jumpsuit, his fingers trembled. The scent of jasmine and rain and pure, undiluted Omega intensified as he drew the zipper down. He worked with a detached, medical efficiency that felt entirely false. He peeled the damp fabric away, his gaze clinical, refusing to linger. But the sight of the pale, flushed skin, the delicate line of a collarbone, the vulnerable hollow of a throat, was not a clinical sight. It was achingly, devastatingly human. A body that had been hidden, suppressed, and was now fiercely, painfully alive. He found a soft, thermal blanket, a luxury item he kept for rare moments of systemic downtime, and wrapped it around Elian's shivering form. The Omega murmured something, his voice thick with delirium. The words were slurred, nonsensical, but Kalen leaned closer, compelled to listen. Cold. The files are so cold, Elian whispered, his brow furrowed in distress. He was lost in a fever dream, trapped between the sterile world of his archives and the biological storm overwhelming him. Kalen gently brushed the damp hair back from his forehead. The gesture was slow, tender, and utterly alien to him. He was a man whose hands were trained to restrain, to disarm, to neutralize. He did not do gentle. He did not do tender. Yet here he was, tending to a feral Omega in his own apartment, an act of treason that could cost him everything. He stood up and walked to the far side of the room, putting distance between himself and the intoxicating proximity of the Omega. He needed to think. He needed to analyze the situation logically, strip it of the hormonal chaos. Fact, he had brought an unsuppressed Omega to his private residence. Fact, he had failed to report a level crimson biological event. Fact, he was actively harboring a fugitive from the Biological Purity Act. Conclusion, he had compromised his position, his career, his very life, for a reason he could not comprehend. Why? The scent. It all came back to the scent. It was more than just a pheromonal trigger. It was a signal, a specific address. It felt like a memory he couldn't place. He closed his eyes, trying to force his mind past the instinctual fog. He pushed past the immediate, overwhelming urge to go to the Omega, to cover him with his own body, to scent him, to claim him. He pushed deeper into the cold, dark recesses of his own memory. And for the first time in his adult life, a crack appeared in the seamless wall of his own conditioning. A flicker, an image, so faint it was like an after-image, burned onto his retinas. Not a memory, but the ghost of one. The scent of jasmine, not from the Omega on his sofa, but from a sun-drenched garden. The feel of a small, warm hand in his. A child's laugh. The image was gone as quickly as it came, leaving him with a phantom ache of loss so profound it made him gasp. He stumbled back, his hand hitting the cold, smooth surface of the wall, grounding him. What was that? His childhood records were sealed, as were all records of high-caste alphas. Their upbringing was a meticulously controlled process, designed to strip away sentimental attachments and forge them into perfect instruments of the state. There were no sun-drenched gardens. There were no laughing children. There was only the sterile environment of the alpha acclimation creche. And yet, the sensory data was there, a ghost in his own machine. He looked over at Elian, who had quieted now, his breathing still shallow, but more regular, lost in the depths of his fever. The scent of jasmine was his scent. The connection was undeniable. This wasn't random. This wasn't a biological anomaly. This was a signal, a key, unlocking a room in his mind that he had been conditioned to believe did not exist. He was an executor. His purpose was to eliminate variables. But what if this variable was not a variable at all? What if it was the one single constant in a life built on lies? The thought was heretical. It was madness. But as he stood there, in the sterile white silence of his apartment, the only truth he could feel in his entire being was the presence of the Omega on his sofa. He was not a problem to be solved. He was a mystery to be unraveled. And Kalen, for the first time in his life, felt a flicker of something other than duty. He felt fear and a terrifying, exhilarating surge of curiosity. The night bled into a long, timeless stretch of fever and fractured whispers. Kalen did not sleep. He kept a silent vigil, pacing the confines of his apartment like a caged wolf. He watched the Omega, now a still form cocooned in the dark grey blanket, his breathing a shallow rhythm in the oppressive silence. The heat was a living entity in the room, a palpable wave of energy that ebbed and flowed. During its peaks, Elian would thrash and murmur, his hands clenching, his body arching with the force of the biological imperative. During the lulls, he would sink into a heavy, exhausted stillness. Kalen tended to him with a grim, detached focus that was a lie. He brought him water, touching the cool glass to lips that were dry and parted. He replaced the cool, damp cloths on his forehead, his fingers brushing against skin that felt like it was burning from the inside out. Every point of contact was a fresh jolt to his system, a reinforcement of the impossible connection that held him captive. He tried to access his work terminal, to run diagnostics on the city's network, to lose himself in the familiar comfort of data and logic. But the words and code on the screen were meaningless symbols. The only data that mattered was the rising and falling of Elian's chest, the scent that had become the very air he breathed. The phantom memories continued to surface, unbidden and unwelcome. They were slivers of sensation, too fragmented to form a coherent narrative. The rough texture of a stone wall under his small hands, the brilliant, painful green of real grass, the high, sweet sound of another child's voice calling a name he couldn't quite hear, and always the scent of jasmine, inextricably linked with a feeling of safety, of belonging. These were not his memories. They couldn't be. His memories were of training rooms and simulation pods, of the cold touch of his instructors and the metallic taste of nutrient rations. His childhood was a sterile, documented process, not a collage of forbidden sensations. Sometime in the grey hours before the dome would reactivate its simulated dawn, Elian's eyes fluttered open. They were no longer wild with panic, but glazed with fever and a deep, weary confusion. He blinked slowly, trying to focus on the stark white ceiling. Where? His voice was a dry rasp. Kaelin was by his side in an instant, kneeling again. The movement was so swift, so instinctual, it surprised even him. "You are safe," he said. His voice was lower than usual, stripped of its official executor cadence. It was just a voice, a man's voice. Elian's gaze shifted, finding Kaelin. There was no recognition, only a deep, instinctual assessment. He was an Omega, waking in an unknown Alpha's territory. His body was a symphony of alarm bells. A faint, distressed scent began to rise from him again, sharp and fearful. "Who are you?" he whispered. The question hung in the air. Kaelin could have said, "Executor Kaelin, Sector 7 Enforcement Division." He could have said, "The man who should have arrested you." Instead, the truth that came out was simpler and infinitely more complicated. "My name is Kaelin." Elian stared at him, his fever-bright eyes searching Kaelin's face. He seemed to be looking for a threat, but the frantic edge to his fear was softening, blunted by Kaelin's proximity. The Alpha's scent, an undercurrent of cold iron and scorched earth, was not aggressive. It was steady, grounding, a wall against the storm inside him. I don't understand," Elian murmured, his brows knitting together. "The rain, the patch." "It failed," Kaelin finished for him. "The rain washed it away. You are in your first heat." He said the words clinically, a desperate attempt to frame the biological chaos in medical terms. But the word heat felt heavy and loaded in the air between them. Elian flinched, a tremor of shame and fear running through him. "They'll send me for correction," he whispered, his voice breaking. "They'll find me." "They will not," Kaelin stated. It wasn't a reassurance. It was a declaration, a promise, a line drawn in the sand. Elian's eyes widened slightly. He was looking at an alpha in an executor's undersuit, a figure of ultimate authority and power, who was speaking treason as if it were a simple statement of fact. The confusion in his eyes deepened. Why? The question was the same one Kaelin had been asking himself all night. He had no logical answer, no answer that would stand up to a tribunal. He looked at the Omega, at the flush on his high cheekbones, at the vulnerability in his gaze, and the phantom memories flickered again, stronger this time. The scent of jasmine, the feeling of a small hand. "Don't let them take me," a child's voice, pleading, in his head, his own voice. Kaelin started, but he had no words. Instead, another memory fragment broke through. This one was sharper. A room, not the creche. A different room, with soft lighting and brightly colored blocks on the floor. He was a child, maybe 5 or 6. And there was another child with him, smaller, quieter, with dark hair and wide grey eyes. They were playing with the blocks, building a clumsy tower. The other child smelled of something sweet and clean, a scent that made him feel calm and happy. Jasmine. A woman in a white coat was watching them through a one-way mirror. He could see her faint reflection. She was making notes on a datapad. The memory was so vivid, so real, it stole his breath. He saw Elian not as he was now, a man in the grip of a fever, but as that small, quiet boy. The connection clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just a scent. It wasn't just a feeling. It was a memory, buried, redacted, almost erased. He straightened up, his mind racing, the fog of instinct suddenly pierced by a beam of analytical fury. This wasn't a random event. This was a variable the system had created and then tried to delete. He turned and strode to his terminal, his fingers flying across the holographic interface. His executor-level clearance gave him access to vast swaths of the consortium's databases, including sealed and archived projects. He bypassed the standard directories, using back-end command prompts he had learned in advanced intelligence training. He searched for keywords from his fragmented memories. Crash, alternate development, sensory pairing, Jasmine. The system returned nothing. All searches were denied, the files classified above his clearance level. But Kalen was not just an enforcer. He was a master of the system's own logic. He didn't search for the project. He searched for the gaps. He cross-referenced his own Crash records, which were sparse and heavily redacted, with the architectural plans for the facility. He found an anomaly, a section of the building in the oldest blueprints that didn't exist in the current schematics. A wing that had been physically expunged, its records wiped. Projecting the old blueprint over the new, he isolated the ghost wing. He ran a search for any personnel assigned to that wing during the years of his own childhood. The list was short, and every name on it was followed by a single annotation: deceased or transferred to off-world colonies. A clean sweep. Too clean. But one name had a secondary file attached, a disciplinary review that had been improperly purged. Director Aris Thorne. Accusation: emotional contamination of research subjects. Recommendation: reassignment. And attached to that review, a single corrupted data fragment that the purges had missed. A project title: Project Chimera. Kalen's blood ran cold. Project Chimera was a myth, a horror story whispered among the upper echelons. A failed, heretical experiment from the early days of the consortium, an attempt to weaponize the Alpha-Omega bond, to create psychically linked pairs for deep cover intelligence operations. The project was deemed too volatile, the emotional bonds too unpredictable, and it was supposedly dismantled, its subjects reintegrated, its data erased. He forced the corrupted file open. Most of it was unreadable garbage code, but a few lines of text were still intact. Subject Alpha 7 shows unprecedented protective instincts toward Omega 12. Pheromonal resonance exceeds all projected models. The scent marker, a jasmine-based compound, has created a permanent imprinting cascade. The bond is symbiotic. Separation may cause severe psychological trauma to both subjects. Alpha 7, Omega 12. He pulled up his own sealed file. His designation in the creche had been Alpha 7, a cold dread, colder than any fear he had ever known, washed over him. He looked back at Elian, who was watching him, his expression a mixture of fear and a strange, dawning recognition, as if Kalen's revelation was echoing in the depths of his own fevered mind. He was not just a random Omega. He was Omega-12. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was his. The system hadn't just suppressed Elian's biology. It had stolen him. It had stolen Kalen's memories, his past, the one true connection he had ever had, and buried it under decades of conditioning and lies. The cold fury in Kalen's chest coalesced into something hard and sharp. The executor, the guardian of the system, died in that moment. And something else, something far more dangerous, was born in its place. The revelation settled in the room, a tangible weight that displaced the air. Kalen stood frozen before the terminal, the fragmented lines of the Chimera file burning in his mind. Alpha 7, Omega-12, permanent imprinting cascade. It was a clinical description of a stolen life. His life, Elian's life. He looked at his hands. They were the hands of an executor, instruments of a system that had vivisected his own soul and told him it was for the greater good. The rage was a white-hot, silent scream in his skull. It was so pure, so absolute, it transcended emotion and became a state of being. He was no longer a component of the machine. He was its enemy. He turned slowly, his movements deliberate, imbued with a new and terrifying purpose. He met Elian's gaze across the room. The fever was still there, but something else was in his eyes now, a flicker of shared memory, a resonance. The bond, suppressed for 2 decades, was reawakening, stirred by proximity and the raw, unfiltered honesty of the heat. Chimera, Kalen said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. Elian flinched, not in fear, but in recognition. The name echoed in the hollow spaces of his mind. He didn't have the memories, not like Kalen. His mind had been wiped clean and then flooded with suppressants for years. But he had the feelings, the phantom sense of loss that had haunted his quiet life, the inexplicable ache of an amputated part of himself. It all began to coalesce around that single, monstrous word. They lied, Kalen said, his voice flat, devoid of all inflection. The calm was more frightening than any shout. They built us, they bonded us, and then they broke us and pretended we were defective. He crossed the room, his footsteps unnervingly silent on the polished floor. He stopped at the foot of the sofa, looking down at Elian. The Omega was his partner, his other half, engineered by the very state that now hunted him as a deviant. The irony was a blade twisting in his gut. The system's greatest sin was not its cruelty, but its hypocrisy. It preached order while breeding chaos, then buried its mistakes in unmarked graves and redacted files. What? What does this mean? Elian's voice was fragile, but a new strength was threaded through it. The strength of a truce, finally unearthed. It means we were never meant to be apart, Kalen answered. It means your condition is not a flaw. It is a feature they designed, and it means they will not stop until you are neutralized and I am recalibrated. The word recalibrated was a cold euphemism for what they would do to him. A memory wipe, a personality reconstruction. They would strip him of this rage, of this memory, and turn him back into their perfect, loyal dog. The thought was unbearable. His comm unit, integrated into the wall, chimed softly. A Priority 1 summons. Director Vance. Kalen's jaw tightened. The system was already closing in. His failure to report the Omega, his unusual data inquiries, Vance would have noticed. The director was a man who saw patterns in everything, a spider at the center of a vast, invisible web. To him, Kalen's deviation would not be a betrayal. It would be a fascinating, predictable malfunction. They know, Elian whispered, seeing the grim finality on Kalen's face. Panic began to cloud his eyes again. They're coming for me. They are coming for us, Kalen corrected him, and the word us was a vow. He looked at Elian, truly looked at him, not as a mission or a mystery, but as the boy from the ghost memory, the other half of his own soul. The heat was still a raging fire in the Omega's body, but Kalen's own instincts had shifted. The possessive, primal urge had been transmuted by the revelation into something fiercer, sharper, a singular, all-consuming need to protect, to reclaim what was stolen. He would not let them have him. He would burn the entire consortium to the ground first. A plan began to form in his mind, cold, audacious, and born of pure fury. They couldn't run. There was nowhere to run. The consortium was a closed system. Every citizen was tracked, every exit monitored. To flee was to be caught. The only way out was through. They buried the truth, Kalen said, thinking aloud. They built their entire philosophy of control on the lie that our instincts are chaotic and destructive. The Biological Purity Act, the suppressants, the reconditioning, it's all predicated on that lie. He looked at the terminal where the corrupted chimera file still glowed. But the proof of their hypocrisy is still in the system. The full, unredacted files. They wouldn't have destroyed them completely. The architects of this system are arrogant. They keep trophies of their power. The Central Archive, Elian whispered, his archivist's mind making the connection instantly. The Nexus. It's the only place they would store data that's sensitive. It's the system's brain. And we are going to give it a seizure, Kalen said, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time. It was not a pleasant sight. The Nexus is impregnable, Elian argued, a lifetime of conditioning warring with the nascent hope in his chest. No one gets in without authorization. I have authorization, Kalen countered, or rather, I have the means to create it. And you, he looked at Elian, a new respect in his eyes. You know the architecture of the archives better than anyone. Elian stared at him. The executor was proposing the unthinkable, a direct assault on the heart of the consortium. It was suicide. But what was the alternative? The slow, sterile death of reconditioning. A life as a walking ghost, his mind wiped, his body numb again. He thought of his life in the archive, the silent, grey half-life he had mistaken for peace. He thought of the feeling of the rain on his skin, the terrifying, exhilarating moment his body had woken up. He was in pain. He was in danger. But he was alive. For the first time, truly alive. I'll do it, he said, his voice gaining strength. The first wave of the heat was beginning to recede, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion, but also a startling clarity. The fever had burned away the last of his passivity. He was not a flaw. He was a weapon. They both were. Good, Kalen said. He turned and began to strip off his executor undersuit, revealing the lean, powerful muscle beneath. He was all sharp lines, uncontrolled force, a living weapon. He moved to a hidden panel in the wall, one that did not appear on any official schematic of the apartment. It opened to reveal a small arsenal, not consortium-issue equipment, but black market tech he had acquired over the years. A quiet insurance policy he never thought he'd have to cash. He pulled out 2 sets of dark, lightweight tactical gear. We have a very small window, he explained, his voice all business now, the cold executor back in command, but this time his purpose was his own. Vance will summon me. I will go. I will tell him I have the Omega contained and am awaiting a specialist team. It will buy us time. He will expect me to be logical, predictable. I will use that against him. He tossed one of the bundles of gear onto the sofa next to Elian. Your heat will be a problem. The scent will give us away. He paused, then walked to the medical unit. He synthesized a compound, but it wasn't a broad-spectrum suppressant. It was a low-dose pheromone blocker designed for short-term stealth operations. This will mask your scent for a few hours, he said, holding out the injector. It won't stop the heat, but it will hide you from their senses. It will be painful. Your body will fight it. Elian looked at the injector, then at Kalen's unyielding face. He nodded and took it, his hand steady. He was done being passive. He was done being controlled. He pressed the injector to his thigh, and a sharp, chemical cold spread through him, followed by a wave of nausea and a fresh spike of cramping pain. He gasped, but held back a cry, his jaw clenched. Kalen watched him, his expression unreadable, but a muscle feathered in his jaw. The sight of Elian's pain, even self-inflicted and necessary, was a physical blow. The bond, the damned chimera bond, transmitted a faint echo of that pain directly into his own gut. It was a weakness. It was a strength. It was what would keep them alive. He finished gearing up, the black tactical suit a second skin. He was no longer Executor Kalen. He was a ghost, an insurgent. He looked at Elian, who was struggling into the unfamiliar gear, his movements clumsy, but determined. They were a strange pair, the perfect soldier and the broken archivist, the Alpha and the Omega, the system's greatest success and its most terrifying failure. When I leave, you have 10 minutes to be ready, Kalen commanded. I will disable the surveillance on this floor. Meet me at the service conduit, level 42. Do not be late. He strode to the door, pausing with his hand on the panel. He looked back at Elian one last time. The Omega looked small and lost in the oversized tactical gear, but his eyes held a fire Kalen had not seen before. It was the fire of defiance. It was the fire Kalen had just discovered in himself. Elian, he said, using his name for the first time. It felt right. It felt real. Don't get caught. Then he was gone, the door sliding shut, leaving Elian alone in the silent white room, the pain of the blocker a sharp, clarifying reality, the weight of their impossible plan settling upon him. He was no longer an archivist. He was a rebel. And for the first time, he had something to fight for. The meeting with Director Vance took place in the heart of the beast, the Panopticon, the central command hub of the Enforcement Division. It was a vast, circular chamber, its walls a seamless 360-degree screen, displaying data streams from every corner of the city. Vance stood in the center, a calm, still point in a hurricane of information. He was a man of indeterminate age, with a placid face and eyes that saw everything as a solvable equation. He wore the simple, elegant robes of the administrative caste, a stark contrast to Kalen's imposing black uniform. "Executor," Vance said, his voice a soft, reasonable murmur that carried effortlessly across the chamber. He did not turn to face Kalen, his attention fixed on a cascading waterfall of biometric data. "You requested a specialist containment team for a level Crimson Biological, an Omega. Yet your report is incomplete." Kalen kept his expression neutral, his posture rigid, the perfect image of a loyal executor. He had rehearsed this moment 100 times in the silent elevator ride up. "Director, the situation is volatile. The subject is a rare case of spontaneous suppressant failure. Full-blown, unsuppressed heat. I deemed it prudent to secure the subject in a shielded location before transmitting a full report, to prevent pheromonal contamination of the public network. It was a plausible lie. Almost. Prudent, Vance repeated, the word hanging in the air. He turned at last, his eyes, the color of faded slate, fixing on Kalen. There was no accusation in his gaze, only a deep, unnerving curiosity. Your prudence is commendable, executor. However, your biometric data tells a different story. Elevated heart rate, atypical hormonal surges, a stress profile inconsistent with a routine containment procedure. He gestured to a section of the screen, and Kalen's own vital signs appeared, charted in stark clinical lines. You seem personally invested. Kalen's blood ran cold, but he held the director's gaze. The subject's pheromonal output is exceptionally potent, Director. A unique profile. It required a significant degree of physiological control to subdue. I see, Vance said, though his expression indicated he saw far more. And where is this subject now? Contained in my residence, per Emergency Protocol 17 Delta. The apartment's shielding is sufficient to contain the pheromonal signature. I await the team to transfer the subject to the correction center. Every word was a carefully chosen brick in a wall of deception. He was counting on Vance's arrogance, on his belief in the infallibility of the system's conditioning. An executor like Kalen did not break. He bent, perhaps, under extreme pressure, but he did not break. Vance was silent for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. He was running 1,000 calculations, weighing probabilities. Kalen could feel the man's intellect probing at his defenses, searching for the flaw in his logic. Very well, executor, Vance said finally, turning back to the main screen. I will dispatch the Chiron team. They are specialists in unique cases. They will meet you at your residence in 30 minutes. You will transfer the subject into their custody and submit to a full psychological and biological debriefing. A test. Vance was giving him enough rope to hang himself. The Chiron team was not a simple containment unit. They were the director's personal troubleshooters, scalpels used for the most delicate and brutal operations. They would not be coming to sedate an Omega. They would be coming to erase a problem. Understood, Director, Kalen said, his voice a mask of perfect compliance. He gave a crisp, formal bow and turned to leave. Executor, Vance's voice stopped him at the door. Project Chimera, an interesting choice of archival query for a man dealing with a feral Omega. Purely academic curiosity, I presume? Kalen froze, his back to the director. The spider had found the thread. He didn't turn. He didn't speak. He simply inclined his head in a shallow nod and walked out of the panopticon, the feeling of Vance's analytical gaze burning into his back. The game had changed. This was no longer just a heist. It was a race. He moved with grim purpose, his path taking him not toward his apartment, but deeper into the administrative sector. He had bought them, perhaps 20 minutes. No more. He used his executor override codes to access the building's maintenance schematics, his mind working with the cold, fast precision of a combat computer. He rerouted elevator protocols, created ghost service requests, and, most importantly, triggered a series of low-level cascading power failures in the surveillance grid around his residential spire. A digital smokescreen. By the time he reached the designated service conduit on level 42, a dark, narrow passage humming with the thrum of the building's life support. Elian was already there. He was a shadow in the gloom, his face pale, but his eyes burning with a fierce, anxious light. The tactical gear, which had looked oversized before, now seemed to fit the new hardness in his posture. He was holding a compact datapad, its screen glowing with complex architectural diagrams. "You were almost late," Elian said, his voice a low, tense whisper. "I met a friend," Kalen replied grimly. "We don't have much time. Vance knows, or he suspects enough to make no difference." He looked at the datapad in Elian's hands. "Did you find a path?" "The Nexus isn't a single location," Elian explained, his archivist's knowledge now a critical weapon. "It's a distributed network, but the core server, the one with the deep storage archives, is located in the foundation of the old Acclamation Creche. For security, they built the new city on top of the old sins." The irony was so thick, Kalen could taste it. They would have to return to the very place their lives were torn apart to find the truth. "The primary access routes will be locked down," Elian continued, tracing a path on the screen with his finger. "But there's a secondary system, a geothermal exhaust vent. It was part of the original structure. According to the old plans, it connects to the server coolant system. It's not on any modern schematic. It's a forgotten door. Can we get to it? It's a long way down, through the city's underbelly, service tunnels, forgotten sublevels. It's a maze." "Then we'd best get started," Kalen said. He took the lead, plunging into the darkness of the service conduit. The air grew thick and humid, the sterile scent of the upper city replaced by the smell of hot metal, ozone, and damp enclosed spaces. They moved in silence, a pair of ghosts navigating the arteries of the machine that wanted them dead. Kalen moved with practiced ease, his body accustomed to navigating treacherous terrain. Elian was less graceful, but more knowledgeable, guiding them through the labyrinthine network with the certainty of a man who had spent his life studying maps of forgotten places. The pheromone blocker was clearly taking its toll on him. His face was slick with sweat, and Kalen could see a fine tremor in his hands. But his resolve never wavered. As they descended deeper into the city's guts, the bond between them became a silent, humming current. It was no longer just a scent or a phantom memory. It was a tangible connection, a low-level telepathic link that had been dormant for 2 decades. Kalen could feel the sharp, cramping pain in Elian's gut as a dull ache in his own. He could feel the younger man's fear, but also his steely determination, and Elian, in turn, could feel Kalen's cold, focused rage, a feeling so immense it was like standing next to a star. It didn't frighten him. It anchored him. They were 2 halves of a whole, their strengths and weaknesses perfectly complementary. Kalen was the sword, Elian the key. After what felt like hours, they reached their destination, a massive circular grate and the floor of a cavernous, abandoned substation. The air that billowed up from it was hot and smelled of sulfur and superheated water. "The geothermal vent," Elian confirmed, his voice echoing in the vast space. Kalen pried the heavy grate open. Below was a sheer, black drop, the darkness punctuated by the faint, rhythmic glow of the coolant system far below. He secured a high-tensile cable from his pack to a support beam and tossed the rest into the abyss. "I'll go first," he said. "Stay close." He clipped his harness to the line and began his descent, rappelling into the hot, suffocating darkness. Elian followed without hesitation, the boy who was afraid of heights in the archives now willingly plunging into the bowels of the earth. The descent was dizzying. The smooth metal walls of the shaft were slick with condensation. The hum of the city above faded, replaced by the deep, resonant thrum of the Nexus core. It was the sound of the system's heart beating. As they neared the bottom, the psychic noise from the bond intensified. This place, the foundation of their old prison, was saturated with memory. Kalen felt a wave of childish terror, the feeling of being small and helpless. Elian gasped, clutching his head as a sharp, piercing image flashed through his mind. A white room, a needle, the feeling of his own scent being chemically burned out of him. They were not just entering a server room. They were entering their own shared trauma. Kalen landed softly on the service platform at the bottom of the shaft. He unclipped and turned to help Elian, whose face was ashen. He was trembling violently now. The combination of the blocker, the physical exertion, and the psychic echo of the place pushing him to his limit. Kalen put a steadying hand on his shoulder. The contact was grounding for both of them. "We're here," Kalen said, his voice low. "Just a little further." Before them was a heavily reinforced blast door, the entrance to the server coolant nexus. There was no keypad, no visible lock. It was sealed. "It's biometrically sealed," Elian whispered, leaning against the wall for support. "To the original project director's signature, Aris Thorne." "Who is long dead," Kalen finished, his eyes scanning the door. "So we can't open it." "No," Elian said, a strange, faint smile on his lips. He looked at Kalen, his grey eyes seeming to glow in the dim light. "But maybe we can." He reached out and placed his hand on the smooth, cold surface of the door. "The bond. It's a key. They designed it. It's part of their system. What if the system still recognizes its own creation?" Kalen stared at him, then at the door. It was an insane long shot, a desperate hope. But they were long past sane options. He stepped forward and placed his own hand on the door, next to Elian's. The moment their skin touched, a jolt of energy, pure and white-hot, arced between them. The psychic bond, the chimera link, flared into full, brilliant life. The shared memories, the stolen feelings, the engineered connection, it all surged through them, no longer a whisper, but a deafening roar. And in the center of the blast door, a thin, blue line of light appeared, scanning their hands, their DNA, their very essence. The system was checking its archives, searching for a ghost. And for a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, resonant thud, the locks on the door disengaged. It hissed open, revealing the cold, blue-lit sanctuary of the Nexus core. They were in. The air inside the Nexus was freezing, a stark contrast to the geothermal heat of the shaft. It was a cathedral of data, silent and sterile, rows upon rows of server towers glowing with a soft cyan light. This was the sanctum sanctorum of the consortium, the mind of God. In the center of the circular chamber, a single pillar of shimmering crystalline light pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm. The core data hub. Everything was here. Every lie, every secret, every redacted sin. For a moment, they were paralyzed by the sheer scale of it. They were two insignificant specks of dust in the face of an infinite machine. But the bond between them, now fully blazing awake, was a shield against the overwhelming awe. It was a singular, defiant truth in this temple of lies. "The Chimera files should be in a quarantined partition," Elian murmured, his voice hushed with reverence and fear. He moved toward a secondary terminal near the core, his fingers already flying across its holographic interface. His lifetime of navigating complex data structures was now their most potent weapon. I can find the partition, but it will be triple encrypted. I can't break it. You won't have to, Kalen said, his gaze fixed on the entrance. You just have to get it ready. He drew the compact, high-energy pulse pistol from his hip. He was not a hacker. He was an executor. His solutions were more direct. A soft chime echoed through the chamber. The blast door they had entered through began to hiss shut. They were sealed in. He's here, Kalen said, his voice calm. He didn't need to specify who. From the opposite side of the chamber, a hidden door irised open, and Director Vance stepped through. He was alone. He was not wearing his administrative robes, but a simple, dark tunic. He looked less like a director and more like a priest entering his own temple. He showed no surprise, no anger, only a kind of weary disappointment. Alpha 7, Vance said, his voice soft but resonant in the cold air. I must confess, I am impressed. To use the bond as a key, Iris Thorne would have been so proud. She always did. Believe the connection was more than just conditioned response. She believed it had a soul. You knew, Kalen stated, the pulse pistol held steady, aimed at the director's chest. You knew what we were. Of course, Vance replied with a sigh. I was Dr. Thorne's junior research assistant on the Chimera project. I was there the day you were bonded. I watched you build towers with your little Omega. It was touching. The director's placid tone made the memory feel obscene. Project Chimera was a beautiful, radical idea, an attempt to harness the deepest biological imperatives for a higher purpose. But it was flawed. The bond creates attachment. Attachment creates loyalty conflicts. It makes perfect soldiers unpredictable. It makes them weak. It makes them human, Kalen countered, his voice a low growl. Precisely, Vance agreed, a flicker of a smile on his lips. And humanity is a variable we have worked for a century to control. When the project was decommissioned, most pairs were successfully separated and reintegrated. The bond withered. But you two, your connection was too strong, too pure, a 1 in a billion anomaly. Wiping your memories wasn't enough. We had to separate you, suppress him. He gestured vaguely toward Elian, who was still working furiously at the terminal, and rebuild you from the ground up as the perfect symbol of the order you were threatening. The confession was delivered with the dispassionate air of a scientist discussing a lab rat. The sheer breathtaking arrogance of it stole Kalen's breath. They hadn't just been a mistake to be buried. They had been a trophy. Kalen, the perfect executor, was Vance's ultimate triumph over the chaos he so despised. And now you are here, Vance continued, taking a slow step forward. A testament to my failure. The flaw in the code has resurfaced. But every problem has a solution, Kalen. It's not too late. We can fix this. We can fix you. Give me the Omega. Let us correct the error. You can be restored. You can have your purpose back. He was offering a deal, a return to the cold, clean certainty of his old life. All he had to do was betray the other half of his soul. He was offering him oblivion. Kalen laughed. It was a harsh, ugly sound that echoed off the server towers. My purpose, he snarled. My purpose was never to serve this machine. It was to find him. He felt Elian's presence at his back, a silent wave of confirmation. The Omega had found the partition. He had it primed. A sentimental choice, Vance said, his face finally showing a flicker of emotion. Pity. You would choose one flawed, emotional creature over the perfect, logical order that has kept billions safe and productive. You would choose chaos. I would choose him, Kalen said. and the words were the truest thing he had ever spoken. In that moment, he was not Alpha 7, not an executor. He was just Kalen, and his choice was made. "So be it," Vance said softly. He raised his hand, and the lights in the chamber flickered. The core hub pulsed with an angry red light. "The Nexus is a closed system, Kalen. I am its administrator. You cannot win." The air grew heavy, charged with an invisible energy. Kalen felt a crushing psychic pressure bear down on him, a direct assault from the Nexus channeled through Vance. It was the collective weight of the system, a wave of pure order and logic designed to overwhelm and shatter his individual consciousness. His mind reeled. His conditioning screamed at him to obey, to submit. The image of Vance swelled until he seemed like a god, infallible and absolute. But then he felt another presence inside his mind. Alien. The bond, the chimera link, was a two-way street. Alien, who had lived his life in a state of sensory deprivation, was now wide open, and through him flowed not logic, but pure, unadulterated emotion. He pushed back against the psychic assault, not with force, but with feeling. He flooded the bond with the terror of the rain, the pain of the heat, the quiet desperation of his years in the archive, and the fierce, burning hope of their reunion. It was chaos. It was raw, messy, illogical humanity. And the system didn't know how to process it. The psychic pressure wavered. Vance staggered back, his hand flying to his temple, his placid expression cracking in confusion and pain. "What is this? This is not in the data. This is just noise." "Now," Kalen roared. He fired his pulse pistol not at Vance, but at the crystalline containment field around the core hub. The energy bolt struck it, and the crystal didn't shatter, but it overloaded, sending a cascade of sparks down its length. Elian slammed his hand down on the terminal. "Broadcasting," he yelled. "System-wide, unsecured channel." The Chimera files, the full, unredacted truth of the consortium's greatest lie, were unleashed. Not just the files, but the feeling, the raw psychic echo of the bond itself, amplified by the Nexus core and piggybacking on Elian's emotional broadcast. Across the city, on every screen, on every public announcement system, the data flooded out. The faces of the children, Kalen and Elian, playing in the sun-drenched garden. Dr. Thorne's logs detailing the permanent imprinting cascade. Vance's own reports on the unpredictable emotional attachment, and woven through it all, a feeling, the ache of separation, the joy of reunion, the defiant, chaotic power of a bond that refused to be broken. It was a virus of truth, of emotion, injected directly into the heart of the sterile, logical machine. Vance stared in horror as his temple of order dissolved into chaos. "What have you done?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "You've broken it. You've broken everything." "No," Kalen said, lowering his weapon as alarms began to shriek throughout the facility. "We've fixed it." He grabbed Elian's hand, their fingers lacing together. The contact was solid, real. "Let's go." They ran for the geothermal vent shaft as the Nexus core went into critical failure, red lights flashing, the entire structure groaning around them. Vance did not try to stop them. He simply stood amidst the ruins of his perfect world, a king on a throne of collapsing data, his expression one of utter, uncomprehending defeat. Kalen and Elian didn't look back. They clipped onto the cable and ascended into the darkness, leaving the heart of the consortium to die behind them. They were rising from the grave of their past, together. The escape was a blur of motion and sound. The shrieking alarms from the nexus followed them up the shaft, a discordant symphony heralding the system's collapse. As they emerged back into the abandoned substation, the deep foundational hum of the city had changed. It was no longer a steady, monolithic drone, but a fractured, arrhythmic stutter. The virus was spreading. Kalen's priority was no longer concealment, but speed. The city's internal security would be in chaos, its command structure decapitated by the data dump, but pockets of enforcers loyal to their last programmed directive would still be a threat. They raced through the labyrinthine service tunnels, moving upward, always upward, toward the surface, toward the sky. The bond between them was a live wire, humming with a mixture of terror, exhaustion, and a wild, unbridled exhilaration. They didn't need to speak. Kalen could feel Elian's flagging energy, the lingering pain from the pheromone blocker warring with the resurgent tide of his heat. Elian, in turn, felt Kalen's relentless, forward-driving momentum, a force of nature that pulled him along, keeping him on his feet when his own strength threatened to fail. They were a single entity, moving with a shared purpose. They burst out of a service hatch into a lower-level commercial district. The scene was one of quiet, bewildered chaos. The ever-present public information screens, which normally displayed productivity quotas and soothing civic mantras, were frozen on the image of two small children holding hands in a garden. The audio systems, usually silent or playing calming ambient tones, were broadcasting the frantic, censored logs of the Chimera project. Citizens, in their drab, functional clothing, stood frozen on the moving walkways, staring at the screens, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning comprehension. The lie was so fundamental, so deeply ingrained, that its exposure was not met with riots, but with a profound, system-wide paralysis. They had been told their instincts were a disease. Now, they were being shown that the cure was built on a foundation of manufactured deceit. For the first time, the people of the consortium were being forced to feel something other than placid compliance, and they didn't know what to do. Kalen and Elian, clad in their black tactical gear, moved through the frozen crowds like wraiths. No one tried to stop them. They were part of the nightmare, figures from the forbidden data made real. They were no longer just fugitives, they were symbols. They reached the outer sectors of the city, the districts that bordered the massive permacrete walls and the geodomes that sealed them off from the outside world. Here the chaos was more pronounced. Automated security drones flew erratic patterns, their targeting systems confused by conflicting directives. A squad of enforcers stood motionless, their helmets turned toward a screen displaying Vance's panicked attempts to shut down the broadcast, their own loyalty protocols caught in a logic loop. Kalen led them to a freight transport hub, a place where automated cargo haulers were loaded for the rare off-world shipments, or more commonly, to take waste to the reclamation plants in the toxic zones outside the city. He hot-wired the launch controls of a small atmospheric skiff, its engines whining to life with a protest of neglected machinery. "Get in," he ordered, pulling Elian into the cramped cockpit. The Omega collapsed into the co-pilot's seat, his body finally succumbing to the immense strain. The pheromone blocker had worn off completely, and his scent, no longer masked, filled the small space. It was no longer just the sweet, fragile scent of jasmine and rain. It was deeper now, richer, laced with the metallic tang of Kalen's own alpha scent, which had inevitably permeated his skin, his clothes. It was the scent of a bond, of a claim made and accepted. Kalen slammed the cockpit shield shut just as a security alert finally pinpointed their location. Red lights flashed across the launch bay. He pushed the throttle forward and the skiff shot out of the bay, a black dart against the bruised twilight of the failing sky dome. They soared over the city, a sprawling grid of perfect, orderly lights, now flickering and dying in patches. Below them, the system was having a stroke. He could see small fires, crowds gathering in the plazas, the first true chaotic expressions of dissent in a generation. They had not just escaped. They had shattered the glass, and the whole sterile terrarium was cracking. He pushed the skiff to its maximum velocity, heading for the weakest point in the geodome, a section under repair where the energy field was already fluctuating. As they approached, a warning klaxon blared in the cockpit. 2 enforcement pursuit drones were closing in fast, their sleek predatory shapes resolving out of the gloom. "Hold on," Kalen gritted out, his hands sure and steady on the controls. He threw the skiff into a spiraling dive, the drones mimicking the maneuver perfectly. Laser fire stitched the air around them, brilliant green lines that illuminated the cockpit in stark, momentary flashes. Elian, strapped into his seat, was pale, but his eyes were clear. He wasn't panicking. He placed a hand on Kalen's arm. Through the bond, he sent not fear, but a wave of calm, focused trust. He sent an image, a memory from the archives, the schematics of the pursuit drones, their targeting sensors, their weak points. Kalen's mind absorbed the data instantly. He pulled the skiff up into a sharp, impossible climb, feigning a stall. The drones, programmed for optimal pursuit vectors, moved to flank him, exposing the unarmored sensor arrays beneath their main chassis. At the apex of his climb, Kalen cut the engines, letting the skiff fall backward, and fired 2 precise shots from the skiff's light-duty particle cannons. The bolts struck home. The drones convulsed, their engines sputtering, and plunged into the city below, exploding into silent blossoms of fire against the dark cityscape. Kalen re-engaged the engines and leveled out, his breathing harsh in the sudden quiet. He glanced at Elian. The Omega gave him a weak, tired smile. "You learned fast," Elian murmured. "I had a good teacher," Kalen replied, the words feeling inadequate. They reached the dome. The energy field ahead shimmered, a translucent, wavering curtain of light. It was their last barrier. "It's going to be rough," Kalen warned. He pushed the throttle to its absolute limit, the small craft's frame groaning in protest. They hit the failing energy field with a deafening shriek of tearing metal and tortured energy. The cockpit was flooded with a blinding white light, and the entire skiff shuddered violently, as if it were being torn apart. Kalen fought the controls, his muscles straining, his entire focus narrowed to this single, violent point of transition. And then they were through. The light and noise vanished, replaced by a sudden, profound silence and a deep, velvety darkness. The air in the cockpit, recycled and sterile, was instantly replaced by the air of the outside world, flooding in through a crack in the cockpit shield. It was cold, damp, and smelled of wet earth, decaying leaves, and 1,000 living things. It was the smell of freedom. Below them was not a grid of lights, but an endless, rolling expanse of darkness, a landscape of hills and forests under a sky choked with real clouds, a brilliant gash of stars visible between them. The city behind them was a dying geometric glow on the horizon, a prison they had just broken out of. They were free. They were fugitives. The world was vast and unknown and dangerous, and they were completely, utterly alone. Kalen eased back on the throttle, letting the skiff glide on the night wind. He looked over at Elian. The Omega had his head leaned back against the seat, his eyes closed, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. He was exhausted, in pain, but he was breathing the free air for the first time in his life. Kalen reached out and took his hand. Their fingers intertwined, a perfect fit. The bond between them settled, no longer a frantic signal of distress and battle, but a deep, quiet, steady hum. The hum of home. The city was burning behind them, but ahead, in the darkness, a new world was waiting. They flew for hours, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the dying glow of the consortium. Kalen followed the faint, silvery line of a river, a natural landmark in a world he only knew from maps. The skiff's energy cells were nearly depleted, and dawn was a pale, grey promise on the eastern horizon when he found a place to land. A small, hidden meadow, encircled by ancient, towering trees that seemed to scrape the clouds. He brought the skiff down with a soft bump on the damp earth and powered down the engines. The silence that descended was unlike any silence he had ever known. It was not the pressurized, manufactured silence of the archive or his apartment. It was a rich, complex tapestry of sound, the whisper of wind through leaves, the distant call of a night bird, the gentle gurgle of a nearby stream. It was the sound of a world that was unapologetically, chaotically alive. Kalen opened the cockpit shield. The morning air was crisp and cold, carrying the scent of pine and wet soil. He unstrapped himself and turned to Elian. The Omega was asleep, his face relaxed in exhaustion, the harsh lines of fear and pain finally smoothed away. The heat had broken sometime during their flight, the fever receding, leaving him pale and fragile, but no longer at war with himself. Kalen watched him for a long moment, the protective instinct in his chest so powerful it was a physical ache. This was the boy from the garden. This was the man who had torn down a century of lies with him. This was his Omega. This was Elian. He gently unstrapped him, his movements careful, not wanting to wake him. He scooped him up into his arms, the way he had in the rain-slicked plaza what felt like a lifetime ago. This time, there was no hesitation, no internal conflict. It was the most natural thing in the world. Elian was light, his body pliant in sleep. He murmured softly and curled into Kalen's warmth, his face pressing against the rough, tactical fabric of Kalen's suit. His scent, now calm and content, was a soft cloud of jasmine and petrichor, a perfect counterpoint to Kalen's own steady scent of iron and earth. Kalen carried him from the skiff and walked a short distance to the edge of the stream. He sat down at the base of a massive, moss-covered tree, settling Elian carefully in his lap, cradling him against his chest. He pulled a thermal blanket from a storage compartment in his suit and wrapped it around them both, creating a small cocoon of warmth against the morning chill. The sun began to rise, filtering through the dense canopy in dappled shafts of gold. The light touched Elian's face, illuminating the fine, dark lashes resting on his pale cheeks. Kalen found himself tracing the line of Elian's jaw with his eyes, the curve of his lips, the delicate shell of his ear. He was memorizing him, relearning a face he had known before he had words for it. They had saved each other. Elian had saved him from the sterile prison of his own mind, from the cold, empty purpose of being an executor. He, Ti-Hor, had saved Elian from the rain, from the systemic violence that would have erased him. Their shared past, a weapon designed by their enemies, had become their salvation. The bond, meant to be a tool of control, had become the ultimate instrument of liberation. Elian stirred, his eyelids fluttering. He blinked, his grey eyes slowly focusing on the unfamiliar pattern of leaves and light above him. Then his gaze shifted, finding Kalen's. There was no fear, no confusion, only a deep, quiet recognition. A homecoming. "Kalen," he whispered, his voice soft with sleep. "I'm here," Kalen replied, his own voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. Elian shifted, not to move away, but to press closer, resting his head on Kalen's shoulder. He took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the forest, of the morning, of the alpha who held him. "Is it over?" he asked. Kalen looked toward the horizon in the direction of the city they had left behind. "For them, it's just beginning," he said. "The system we broke was brittle. It was built on a single, fundamental lie. Without that lie, it can't stand. There will be chaos, factionalism, war, maybe. They will have to find a new way to live." "And us?" Elian asked, his voice small. Kalen looked down at him, at the man curled in his arms. He thought of the future, a vast, unknown territory. They were fugitives. They had no resources, no allies. The world outside the consortium was harsh and unforgiving. They would be hunted. They would struggle. But they would be together. He tightened his arm around Elian, a silent vow. He leaned down and pressed his forehead against Elian's, a gesture of profound, instinctual intimacy. "For us," Kalen said, his voice a low, certain rumble that vibrated through both of them, "it is also just beginning." Elian closed his eyes, a soft, genuine smile finally gracing his lips. He was no longer an archivist, a designation, a biological flaw. Kalen was no longer an executor, an asset, a tool of the state. They were just two people, sitting at the edge of a stream in the light of a new day, their stolen past reclaimed, their uncertain future their own to write. The air around them was filled with their mingled scents, a perfect, harmonious chord that the wind carried away, a quiet promise scattered among the ancient trees. They were free, and for the first time, they were whole.